Welcome to Unit 3 of the Technology, Innovation, and the Civil War course. I'm Dr. Nick Sambaluk. For a Technology and Innovation course, two items in particular stand out and merit a spotlight as quickly as possible. One is a weapon technology. The other is both a cause and an effect of the way that Civil War armies mobilized for war. Today, we examine the infantry rifle musket and the institution of the Civil War so-called political general. The smoothbore musket, in general use from the 17th century onward, and in combination with the socket bayonet from the 1680s, characterized Western infantry arms for over a century. Easier to use than a longbow, farther ranging than a pike, it nonetheless had shortcomings. The limited range of the smoothbore musket meant that infantry had long to advance to distances of 100 yards to fire on the enemy, and to ranges of 50 or even 30 yards before their firepower was truly devastating. Since reloading required 20 to 30 seconds to do the actual process, an enemy might successfully charge after only one or two effective shots had been fired by any particular infantryman working en masse in firing volleys. Only one bullet could be ready to fire at a time, and the flint ignition system, although it was less susceptible to failure than the matchlock before it, was still unreliable. Perhaps 1 in 5 attempts to shoot produced a misfire. Spent propellant caked the barrel inside the gun, and this too impeded accuracy. The bayonet was thus a vital element in the musket as a weapons system. While early rifles were used by a few military specialists in the 18th century, in the 1700s, they were no silver bullet, so to speak. Rifles offered better, somewhat better, accuracy and better range, but they were even slower to load than muskets. Attempts to load at the back, at the breech of the gun instead of the mouth or muzzle, implied faster reloading, but this increased the chance of less than airtight mechanisms leading to an explosion that would happen in the gunner's face, which obviously is not what a gun designer would want to produce. What we have here is a Springfield pattern 1863 rifle musket for demonstration. The most common weapons of the U.S. Civil War were the Springfield 1861 pattern, the Springfield 1863 pattern, and the British Enfield rifle musket. Both sides imported the last weapon in the hundreds of thousands. A total of approximately 900,000 of these weapons were brought over from Britain and used by both sides during the conflict. By the time of the Civil War, several of the shortcomings of the musket were being addressed. The flint ignition had been superseded by the use of small metallic percussion caps fitted over the primer hole at the gun's breech. The inside base of the cap was covered in fulminate of mercury, a substance that was prone to explode upon heavy impact, like being hit with a hammer. The biggest innovation, though, came with the use of a practical system for muzzle loading a rifle. Claude Minié was a French army officer. He realized in the middle of the 1800s that a more cylindrical bullet with a convex front would be more aerodynamic than a simple lead ball which had traditionally been used. Minié also realized that a muzzle loading system required a bullet to be dropped down a barrel, and therefore the bullet had to be smaller than the diameter of the barrel. Yet at the same time, it needed to be able to expand somehow to the width of the barrel as it was being fired. Otherwise, the bullet would not engage the rifling pattern inside the gun. And if it didn't, it wouldn't spin and maintain its fired course. Mashing a small lead ball into a fatter oval allowed loading and firing and had been used prior to Minet. But this method limited the impact of rifling upon bullet accuracy by deforming the shape of the bullet. What Minet did was he introduced a concave shape to the bullet on the back end. The Minet ball, which is in fact a conical bullet, could be dropped down the barrel pretty easily. The explosion of the propellant sent the bottom edge, that concave bottom of the bullet, slightly outward. It expanded with the explosion as the bullet started to go down the barrel. This caused the base of the bullet to engage the rifling pattern inside the barrel and produce a spin, a rotation in the bullet as it went down the barrel and then out toward a target. A Minet ball could hit a target theoretically at 400 or 500 yards. This is 5 or 10 times as far as the really practicable range of a smoothbore musket. For that reason, new guns were called rifle muskets. The old guns, if they were rebored, were sometimes called rifled muskets. The advantage of shooting an enemy from long distances sounds pretty obvious. As with any innovation, we should ask ourselves questions about what caused a new invention, what affected its employment and its popularization, and whether it had the impact that was predicted for it. A bit like a thrown football, a Minet ball spun while traveling, and it traveled in a parabolic route. Backsights on guns, which had not really existed on firearms prior to this period, because they hadn't been accurate enough to be relevant, were introduced in the middle of the 19th century to assist the gunner in his aiming. Firing at a distance requires careful handling of the gun, careful, accurate judging of distance, and the use of a backsight. It also required increased stocks of ammunition, since no one wanted to be out of bullets when the enemy had come close. Most firefights occurred at ranges of between 75 and 130 yards during the Civil War. This was close enough that smoothbore muzzle loaders could be, and in many cases were, used by some troops during Civil War battles. The mobilization innovation that deserves our attention, our early attention, is the use of so-called political generals. The Union raised much larger armies than did the Confederacy. It had a larger manpower base, a bigger population from which to mobilize, but it did mobilize bigger forces. Although it needed a lot of officers for it too. Although most West Pointers remained loyal to the United States, the South had many graduates of state military academies, such as Virginia Military Institute, or VMI, which provided pools of talent, of officership talent for the Confederacy. This was not so much the case for the Union, which had no real pool of state military academies to bolster, to buttress the numbers of trained officers from West Point. The Lincoln administration realized that much of the country was politically aligned with Democrat Stephen Douglas rather than with himself and the Republican Party. Although preserving the Union inspired many people, very few were yet willing to risk death in order to free the slaves. That was still a radical position in contemporary political terms. Even though it was the South that claimed the nominal issue of states' rights, localism was important to most Americans nationwide. To raise big armies, Lincoln relied quickly upon volunteers, making his first call in April 1861 for 75,000 men. The day after the Union defeat at First Bull Run, Congress authorized the creation of a massive army of 500,000, nearly as many troops as Napoleon had gathered in his 1812 campaign against Russia. Local politicians, such as Republican Nathaniel Banks of Massachusetts and John McClelland of Illinois, German Americans like Franz Ziegel, and Democrats like Benjamin Butler of Massachusetts and Dan Sickles of New York, were important in whipping up volunteers, because 500,000 people is a lot for any country to mobilize in the middle of the 19th century, and this was a substantial endeavor. Politicians, though, were well poised to raise units, partly because they tended to be well known in their locality, and they were usually powerful rhetoricians with persuasive speaking talents. Additionally, in a country that still used a spoils system for distributing favors, ingratiating oneself with a local political boss could be valuable after the war. The Union relied on many political officers from both the Republican and the Democratic parties, as well as from significant ethnic blocs like German Americans, many of whom were pro-democracy émigrés arriving in the United States after the crushing of democratic movements in Europe in 1848. The military talents of these officers was admittedly mixed, and much of what they knew about fighting they learned on the job. For your exam, submit answers via email and attached document to the following question to my Purdue address. This is due on February 3 at 12:01 a.m., that is to say, immediately following the midnight close of February 2. Late exams cannot be graded. Repeat, late exams cannot be graded. This is essentially a take-home exam. It's not closed book. It's not timed either, aside from having a deadline. It is to be solely your own work. Handle the exam similarly to a term paper. Make sure that your writing is well argued and backed with evidence. Draw on materials from in the class. Where you refer to something, make sure to properly cite it according to Chicago-Turabian format. That's standard for history courses. Question 1 is for 100 points. Explain the impact of new weapons on the combat of the U.S. Civil War, the fighting itself. Question 2 is for 150 points. Describe the policy, the political objective, innovations that occurred from 1860 through 1865. Overall, did policy innovations mostly shape events, or did the events of the era predominantly drive the policy innovations? Provide evidence and analysis. One more quick note. Bigger is not necessarily better. Good writing is detailed, it is persuasive, and it is concise. Make sure that your answer for each question is no longer than 750 words maximum. Thank you very much. Good luck. We won't have discussion questions this week because we're focusing instead on the exam, so next week we'll look at Gettysburg itself. Good luck.